All right, this is going to be fun. Running through 6 or 7 questions you all submitted in a community post about a week ago. We're going to dive right in here. So the first one from Just a Doc: how do you check in, try to filter out your biases when looking through the content? So this is something I genuinely lose sleep over. It's really hard, and I know I have my own biases. Like at baseline, I only speak English. So when I'm listening to podcasts about the war in Ukraine or anything, for that matter, it's going to be in English. When I'm watching YouTube videos, I will watch some that have subtitles, but I'm drawn to the ones that are in English. And the same when it comes to social media posts. I try to go over to Telegram as often as possible and consume content that is not in English, mostly in Russian and Ukrainian. But it's so much slower than that. I'm just drawn to the stuff that's in English. So I do check other sources from time to time, but that translation process isn't always the fastest, even with some of these apps on the computer. So at the very least, I know that the majority of my information is going to be coming through, an English-speaking lens, if you will. There's a couple ways I try to combat that, and it's a work in progress, right? Never perfect. The first is that I don't try to break news. So anything you see in a video here on YouTube, it's not going to be like something that happened 30 minutes ago and bam, there's a video put out trying to be the first in that category, for instance. I did go down that route a little bit with TikTok a few months ago just because it was so easy. So easy to film a TikTok video and put it up and bam, the content's out there. But the sooner you try to get that information out there, the more likely you are to put out something that's incorrect or maybe doesn't have the full context at the very least. So I've tried to move away from that, and the majority of the stuff you'll see is at the very least a couple days old, or if it's more recent, there's more than one source already commenting on it, usually from both sides of the conflict, which kind of gets into the second part here, which is I really try to avoid using definitive language when talking about a lot of this. And I understand that can be viewed as quibbling and not taking a hard stance, but it's something that's allowed me to feel confident discussing some of these topics, recognizing that I do not have the full picture and certainly won't while this war is going on. And it might be years, even decades after, for us to fully understand, the entirety of any one of these individual events. So when talking about a lot of the information, rather than laying it out as 100% absolute facts, I try to add some language in there, things like it sounds like, or I think, or I believe, this looks like, etc., rather than, this is not to be debated. This is what happened. End of story. All right, next one up from Aiden Carlisle. What books do you recommend? Which have been very impactful for you in life and professional development? So I got 4 here. My favorite right now, I'd say, and has been for a little while, is Sebastian Junger's Tribe. So it just, really hits home from a veteran perspective, like the challenges of trying to connect with folks after or outside the service, but it also applies pretty broadly all across society and pretty quick and easy read. Second one here, heading a little more into the military realm, We Were Soldiers, Once and Young by Colonel Hal Moore. It's the Battle of the Ia Valley in the Vietnam War. The movie's great, but as you can expect, there's going to be a lot more in the book. Like, I don't think people know that this book and the movie is about LZ X-Ray, the Battle of LZ X-Ray in the Ia Valley. There was another battle where guys marched from LZ X-Ray when that wrapped up. They marched over to LZ Albany, is probably the better way to say it, LZ Albany, and it was an even hotter battle there. I think it was twice the number of Americans were killed on Albany than were on X-Ray, and that doesn't really get touched on at all in the movie, but it's a big part of the book. So I love this one. I've gone through it a couple times now. I think it hits on everything from strategy to tactics, from the battalion level down to the individual initiative taken by soldiers. Overall, it's hard to beat. Next one here, Blitzed. This is one I've given out as a gift to people that even might not be that interested in like the military or military history, just because it's so wild. So it's about drug use in the German military during World War II, specifically Pervitin, which I think I'm pronouncing correctly, which is like a form of methamphetamine. So they started by giving it to housewives, I believe, and then over time found out that it keeps people awake, keeps people alert. Could be great for soldiers if they had to carry out something like a blitz across France. And it talks about how some of these generals in Western Europe and France and the United Kingdom were watching this German blitz and think like, it's got to stop. They can't go on like this forever. They're not even sleeping. And sure enough, some of them weren't sleeping. They were staying awake for days, even weeks on end, hyped up on meth, which of course then leads to some pretty serious downsides. And it gets into some of the atrocities committed by German soldiers when they were in this, meth crazed state. So blitzed, it's a wild one. Last one here, and it's kind of on a downer, but I think it's a really important book. It's called Ordinary Men. And this is the story of how ordinary men from either Berlin or Munich at the start of the war, they were just dads, traffic cops, teachers, factory workers, just like regular guys. And it traces their path from that, just being regular, everyday people in Germany, through to being assigned to like a police battalion in Poland, in occupied Poland, to where they're executing women and children. And the whole premise of the book is that these weren't like crazed Nazis that were hell-bent on just carrying out awful acts of violence, but in a relatively short period of time, due to the propaganda and the information that they were being fed, and then the circumstances that they were placed in by their command and the orders they were given by their command, how a lot of these guys went from, again, ordinary men to monsters, committing some of the worst atrocities in the last few hundred years. So to me, the reason I like this book is it's a reminder. I tend to look, and I think a lot of us tend to look at history and think we're better than that. We've adapted from that. That couldn't happen today. And, this wasn't that long ago. This was less than 100 years ago. All things considered, we're pretty similar to the people that, started out as great husbands and fathers, and in the span of just a few years turned into to war criminals, committing awful acts against other human beings. So it's just a reminder that we got to stay alert, we got to stay focused, and can't afford to go anywhere into that darkness, because you can blink and all of a sudden you're in too deep. All right, next up from James. Have you ever thought about going to Ukraine as a volunteer or getting a remote job to assist them? Yes, I thought about it a lot, especially last summer into early fall. It was a pretty serious conversation here on the home front. I've been fortunate to have a handful of invitations from folks to head over that I really trust and look up to, and to enter Ukraine in sort of a media capacity. But as of now, I just don't think it's in the cards. The major issue for me on that front is that I'm still a member of the U.S. military, albeit the reserves. So I don't know what the correct process would look like to go through the Army and the DOD to get signed off on my going there. But at the very least, that would be a pretty serious headache. And then on top of that, really my bigger concern is that my being there could be misrepresented as a representative from the U.S. military roaming around Ukraine. And I don't think that's good for Ukraine. I don't think that's good for the United States. I don't think it's good for me personally. It just feels like it has the potential to do a lot more harm than good. And the same goes for any sort of remote work on behalf of or for Ukraine. That definitely could be a conversation if I was a private citizen, but having, an active connection with the U.S. military, I really have to avoid any sort of ties like that with foreign governments that aren't, at the very least, vetted pretty heavily through the DOD. All right, next up from Jackson. Based on your own personal combat experience, how do you think you would do if you were fighting with Ukraine? So my experience in Afghanistan doesn't really compare at all to what's going on in Ukraine. For reference, I was in Afghanistan for 19 months between June 2010 and December of 2012. A big chunk of that was in Kandahar, down in southern Afghanistan. We had pretty daily firefights for most of the year, at least spring, summer, and fall. But in all those fights, it was pretty lopsided. I mean, the fights would be with, Taliban groupings of 3 to 5, kind of on the high side, and we'd have a squad plus of infantrymen. On top of that, my job as a fire support officer was to make that fight even more lopsided by calling in any sort of additional fires right away. I mean, we really never operated outside of the range of our 81 and 120 millimeter mortars and 155 millimeter howitzers, the 777s. Helicopter support in the form of Apaches and Kiowas was really never more than 10 minutes away max, fixed wing support, A-10s, F-16s. If they weren't already on station, they could be there in another 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes. And just about at all times, there was some sort of drone overhead. We'll call it 50-50, whether it was an armed drone or just surveillance, but that wasn't a fair fight up against the Taliban, right? Like, we always had the upper hand, and that's just not the case in Ukraine. So it's hard to look at the fight that they're involved with, right now in and around Bakhmut, and draw a lot of comparisons from what I went through in Afghanistan. The thing that I think about the most in that context of how would I do there is, well, there's two big ones. First is it's a lot more than one person. So I was only as effective in Afghanistan as the group of people around me, and they were hyper effective. So there's a lot more than just one person moving onto a battlefield. And I can't take my experience in Afghanistan and pluck it out as an individual, because I was a part of a big team, part of a really good team in the Strike Brigade that were backing each other up and supporting each other with the plans and the coordination and the ongoing support. So it's not a one-to-one comparison in a lot of ways. But anyways, one of the big things I think about with Ukraine is the artillery fire. There are men much stronger, much tougher than I that have been broken throughout history under artillery fire, and there's just not a lot you can do to prepare for that. And I don't know. I don't know how I would do in that. I'd like to think that I could keep my wits about me, but I've never been under a sustained, rocket barrage for hours or days on end, or on the receiving end of 6,000 rounds a day over a relatively small sector of the front. So, all in, Afghanistan was a tough fight in a lot of ways. It was scary at times for sure. But in terms of combat, looking at Afghanistan, even Iraq to a degree, that's more of a police action when compared to the combat playing out in Ukraine right now. All right, next question is from SCV Indy. Does the Ukrainian military have enough time to sufficiently master the new equipment? In my opinion, short answer is no. Now, when you look at some of the early kit that went over, AT-4s, Javelins, wheeled vehicles like the MRAP and Humvees, they got it. Not a lot to learn on those. Doesn't take a lot of practice to become, sufficiently mastered, if you will. And the same for like the 777, for instance, the howitzer. There are probably crews in Afghanistan right now that are better trained and better operate that piece of equipment than crews here in the United States. They've just put so many rounds through that barrel at this point under combat conditions that they probably are the masters more than some of our crews here in the U.S. But when you get into some of the more advanced tech, things like the Bradleys, Abrams, and Patriots, they're not experts. It just takes time. And it's not a matter of they didn't go through U.S. basic training at AIT, or, we say it takes 4 months and they only got the 4 months. It's the types of little workarounds and problems that pop up with those systems that just take experience to figure out. Like, you need to see the Bradley break in a certain way to understand how to avoid it breaking the next time and how to fix it this time around. And the same goes for Abrams, Patriots, and HIMARS. Now, I will say that I'm certain that the Ukrainian troops fielding this equipment in battle are trained enough. They might not be masters of all of that equipment, but as a whole, just from what I've heard of some of these units going through training here in the U.S. and elsewhere, I'm confident that they are proficient enough to operate that equipment in combat. All right, next up from Raw Bee. How did you get into beekeeping, and what's your most and least favorite things about the hobby? So we lived in Austin, Texas for a little while, and did this tour of a place called Round Rock Honey on the north side of town, and they were talking about all the different places that people keep bees, and one of them was like backyards in subdivisions and things. And I thought, I didn't know that was a thing, so figured it was worth a shot. We moved to Tennessee, or when we moved to Tennessee, we got a little more land, or just enough kind of space between us and the neighbors to where it felt like we weren't putting bees right in their backyard. And it's been fun. About 3 years now is kind of what we're going, I think. Yeah, I think this is year 3 of trying to figure out beekeeping. So my favorite thing about keeping bees is when you open up the hive and they're flourishing and they're doing well. You can find the larvae and the eggs, and they're starting to cap honey, and there's just a ton of bees in there. It's very, very active. That's awesome. It's not like they can send you a text or leave a note when there's a problem or something's coming up that's not going to be good for the hive. So when the hive is doing really well, it means that either I did the right things for the hive, or more than likely, I didn't do the wrong things. So hands down, that's the best feeling. The worst part isn't the stings. Those do suck. I actually didn't get stung at all the whole first year we were beekeeping. Got a few last year, and then this year's been awful. I don't know what happened, but I'm getting dinged left and right. I did hear, I think I've heard people say that you can kind of build up a tolerance to bee stings. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm nowhere near it. But the worst part of beekeeping for me is that it's like this pit in my stomach when you open up a hive and it's not going well, or the hive has left in some cases, or the colony has left. It's just so much troubleshooting to try to figure out what you need to do and what's too much or what's not enough. And should you be more involved with the hive or feed them more, feed them less? Are they in the wrong location? There's so many pieces to it. And when it doesn't work out for a colony, I feel sick. Like I feel like they didn't survive because of something I did or something I didn't do. So it's a roller coaster of emotions. But again, it's a lot of fun. So if you're thinking about it, strongly suggest you give it a shot. All right, next up from John Stacy, what are your opinions on athletes, especially football players, taking up slots at the prep school for West Point? Should those slots be for guys in our ranks trying to get ahead? So I had to look up some data here to make sure I got it right. But last year's graduating class at West Point was 10% prior service. And for a little context here, USMAPS is the United States Military Academy Prep School. It's located at West Point, and it's designed to kind of give people an extra boost before they start their 4 years of the academy. They still have to do 4 years at actual West Point. They start as a plebe and all that stuff. It's just kind of like an extra year to get ahead. I had to do it, not at USMAPS, but I went through something called the Civil Prep Program, and I spent 1 year between high school and West Point at Marion Military Institute down in Alabama. So USMAPS, which a couple years ago moved to West Point, it used to be in New Jersey, it's made up mostly of, I think it's like 140 people there each year, made up mostly of prior service soldiers coming out of the active or reserve components or National Guard, and then a lot of recruited athletes, mostly football players. And honestly, I think it's a pretty good mix right now. The football program is something that I think has the possibility to really help the Army and West Point kind of in the long run. So football is the only sport from West Point that's ever televised to a national audience. So it gets in front of a lot of people that otherwise may not be familiar with West Point or know what it is or know that it's an option, anything like that. So every time the Army football team, beats a ranked opponent or takes them to the wire or goes to a bowl game, it's a form of recruiting for a specific audience that we don't really get any other way. And honestly, recruiting is something we're hurting at right now. So I'm working on a couple other videos on that front, but I think it helps to get West Point in front of more people that could lead to future cadets or future officers or future soldiers in a way that's hard to beat. So one thing worth adding here is that football players do have to meet all the same standards. So those slots go to football players, but it's not like the standards are dropped through the floor to allow recruited athletes in. They still have to be within a certain threshold academically, physically, with leadership, with their test scores. And then to get into West Point, they still need that nomination. And even once they are at the academy, football players and any recruited athletes have to meet all of the standards year to year in order to progress and to graduate, except for one. They, at least football players, it might apply to some other what we called core squad athletes as well, but with football players, they don't have to meet the height weight standards for the Army until they graduate, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. So it allows them to put on weight and actually be a lineman in a Division I program, but then in order to graduate, they have to cut weight to meet the Army height weight standards. It's usually the tape test for those guys. So that means after, say, a bowl game's in December, from December to May, those guys are just cut until they can pass the tape test. And I can't speak for every class, but at least while I was there, I don't think we had anybody that didn't meet the standards in time to graduate. All that said, I'm not sure that it's a zero-sum game. Like, if a football player takes a slot to USMAPS, I don't know that means that's one less slot for an enlisted soldier. Conversely, if the Corps Squad athletes don't fill that position, I don't think that means an additional opportunity for an enlisted soldier trying to make that jump. I don't have that level of insight into the USMAPS admissions process, but overall, I'll say it's a great program. I had a lot of friends go through USMAPS. It was really, really helpful to a lot of people. So if anybody watching this is thinking of going the West Point route and hasn't heard of USMAPS, look into it because it can really help in the first couple of years of the academy. All right, last one here from Hank Norton. What do you think are the biggest blind spots coming from pro-Ukrainian war bloggers / YouTubers? It's a big one here. So one man's opinion, take it with a grain of salt. But I think the biggest blind spot is this pressure we've created around the idea that on the battlefield, Ukraine can do no wrong and Russia can do no right. And this isn't talking about the morality of the conflict, but the way the war is actually being fought. We tend to see here in the United States more in kind of the mainstream media, main news channels. We see more about Ukrainian successes and Russian failures. But if we stop there, we're missing a major part of this conflict. But the challenge, in my opinion, is that if you talk about areas where Russia has successfully adapted or accomplished an objective and where Ukraine has fallen short, it's met with a pretty strong negative response. And I've been on the receiving end of that more than once. It's met with some pretty nasty comments, DMs, and emails that sucks to get those. How often would you want to open that can of worms? I mean, I personally try to work through that and think this information is important and it needs to be put out there, even if it hurts someone's feelings. But I'd be lying if I said that it hasn't impacted my thought process when I'm putting videos together. One example here, because I'm sure that'll come up, is, but where has this happened before? If you look at the first month of the conflict in the southern part of Ukraine, when all eyes were focused up in the north around the capital city of Kyiv, Russia pulled off a relatively successful operation to secure the land bridge to Crimea, which was known. Like for months and years before this conflict kicked off, one of the major concerns is that is what Russia would try to do at some point in the future. And then the full-scale invasion kicks off in February. You blink, and Russia has that land bridge. So that's the kind of thing that I think deserves more analysis, more discussion, is what happened there. Did Russia successfully execute that operation? Why wasn't Ukraine able to stop them there like they were in portions of the east and further north? And what was with the intelligence? Was Ukraine's intelligence bad? It's one example that I think, you don't see a lot about that, but if you're trying to understand the overall conflict, I think it's important. So overall, when anyone, myself included, is making content about the war in Ukraine, we understand pretty quickly what topics aren't going to go over well, and I think there can be an aversion to covering that. I don't know what the solution is there. A part of me says that the solution is just to keep talking about it. We'll see. That's a problem bigger than the war in Ukraine, for what it's worth. We can kind of see it manifesting in this specific context. All right, but that's it. That's all I got. Really appreciate you leaving those questions to dive into. That was a lot of fun, kind of hitting on things that I wouldn't normally touch on in a video. We'll see if we can't do these a little more frequently. But hope you all have a good weekend. We'll see y'all next time.